The knee is talked about a lot in asana practice. You'll often hear people say, do this to protect the knee. And yes, we definitely want to protect the knee. If we injure the knee, that's a very challenging injury. It takes a long time to come back from. But I also think sometimes when we're saying do something to protect the knee, we're not fully understanding the anatomy of the knee joint. And so I'd like to share a little bit more with you of one particular movement that can damage our knee joint and what we want to look for or watch for. It might be different than what you've been taught. What we want to look for to help try to keep the knee safe in this particular type of movement. My name is Christina Raskin. I'm the founder of Soul Thrive Yoga, and I'm super passionate about anatomy. I'm an anatomy geek. I'm also super passionate about the philosophy, the mindfulness of yoga, and I've seen all of the aspects of yoga, the physical and the mindfulness and meditation, really help me in my life and really help my students. So I'd love to share some of this with you. Let's talk a little bit about the knee joint. A joint is any place where two bones meet. So here we have our femur, our upper leg bone, meeting with our lower leg bone, our tibia. The two bones meet there, and there's a meniscus in between. This is my kneecap pointing forward. And the toes, in this particular case, happen to be pointing forward, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. The knee joint is what's called a modified hinge joint. And the reason we call it that is because it's not a pure hinge joint. Our elbow is a pure hinge joint. It only hinges. Our knee hinges, and it actually does some rotation. Naturally, anatomically, it hinges, but when the knee is bent, not when it's straight, there's also some rotation in the knee joint. And this is natural. It's built in to help us. If you think about, if you fall off a curb, that rotation built in is going to help you to catch yourself. Also, if you're standing one direction, you turn to pivot another direction, that knee is going to rotate a little bit. So if I'm standing here and then I pivot and step the other direction, there's going to be some rotation there. The rotation is okay. That's natural. It's built into our body. So the rotation in and of itself is not a bad thing. The challenge comes when we use this rotation more than we really should, or we exploit it to try to get into a pose. And the reason the rotation can be problematic is because 80% of meniscus tears happen when the knee is bent and rotated. Think of soccer players. I have that a lot. So when the knee is bent and rotated, that's when most meniscus tears happen. Doesn't mean it's going to happen every time, but especially if you put the knee under pressure, weight, when you do that, then it's even more problematic. A lot of times what you hear teachers say is you want your second toe pointing the same direction as your knee. And the reason they're saying that is they're trying to make sure that you're not rotating in the knee joint. Your second toe and knee are pointing straight forward, which in theory makes sense on this guy. But this is a plastic skeleton that was built in a factory. We're not all built like this. There is so much variation amongst skeletons. Between mine and yours, between my left side and my right side, we're parts of nature, so we're not completely symmetrical. We're not exactly the same. So to assume that your kneecap and your toe are going to point straight forward means that there's no rotation isn't totally accurate. There's a couple of different things that might be in play here. One, you might naturally have a little bit of rotation built into your knee joint. So what I mean by that is your two bones might align on a natural rotation. There might be a little bit of rotation there. It's just the way your skeleton is built. If you naturally have rotation, that's fine. The other reason is because our bones don't actually grow straight like they are here. Again, this is fake. They actually rotate as they grow, like the roots of a tree. A lot of times we have rotation in our lower leg bone, which will point the toes out naturally, or at the ankle joint, it'll cause the toes to point out naturally. So if my toes are pointing out here, but my knee isn't rotated, if that rotation is coming from my ankle joint, then the direction the toes and the kneecap are pointing is irrelevant. And if I try to point their toes forward, guess what I've just done? I've now rotated in the knee. I've caused rotation to happen by trying to keep the second toe and the kneecap pointing the same direction because there's actually rotation in the body built in. Now, of course, as a teacher, I can't see that. I don't have x-ray vision, so I don't know. But one way you can kind of maybe see this is when somebody walks naturally. If their toes naturally turn out when they walk, that's probably natural in their body. For me, my right toes turn out more than my left. Whatever's going on there, whether it's in the lower leg bone or in the ankle, that's just natural for me. And the other thing is you can use how the person feels in their body and try this in your body. And sometimes we have to be very aware and really focus on how this actually does feel. But when you're standing in something like Tadasana, try with your toes pointing forward and notice what it feels like in your knees. And then let your feet fall naturally, wherever your toes naturally go, and find an alignment that feels good for your knees. Toes forward might be the case, but for many, many, many of us, it is actually not the case. And again, it might be different. My right side is different than my left. And when I try to point my right toes forward, I feel that in my knee joint. So we want to use what we feel in the knee joint to guide us. The other thing that can be really helpful, as I mentioned, it's a hinge joint with rotation. However, we want to pretend it's only a hinge joint. Like there's no rotation. Ignore the rotation when you're going into yoga poses. Again, the reason being, if you bend the knee and rotate, you have a higher risk of tearing the meniscus. Not going to happen every time, but if we're doing the same pose over and over and over, we might get a repetitive stress or strain injury, an RSI. And thus we want to pretend we don't have that rotation. Treat your knee joint like a pure hinge joint. Just hinge it. No rotation. Okay, well, how do I do that if I can't look at the toe, right? How do I know if that rotation is coming from the lower leg or the knee? Challenge is a lot of times we don't totally know. We're making an educated guess based on what the student is feeling in their knee or what you feel in your knee in your practice. And also we want to try to look at the two bones more than the foot. What I mean by that is when I hinge together, you can see the two bones line up. This would be rotation in the knee when the two bones pull apart. This is a pure hinge. What we want to try to look at is, can I see those two bones? And what I mean by see is try to look through the muscle mass and see how the two bones are lining up. When we hinge and we line the two bones up, the place that we usually tend to use the rotation in the knee joint that we don't want to is when we're doing a pose with a turned out hip joint, externally rotated in the hip joint. So I'll show you on my body. If I hinge my two bones together, here they're hinged in. Now if I rotate out in my hip joint, I can keep those two bones together to a certain degree. So right about there is how far I can turn out while keeping my two bones together. Now if we go into something like lotus, and I'm going to pull this foot up here, I want you to look at these two bones. Can you see this bone? What's going to happen if I pull the foot up? Is it still aligned with my thigh bone? I've done this. I've rotated in my knee joint now to get that foot up. Now, of course, if you have rotation built in there already, then that might be okay. But again, we don't know if you do. But we want to look at, can I keep these two bones together and turn out from the hip joint to whatever degree is comfortable and not exploit the rotation in the knee. So lotus is a big one where we see this, especially for the second leg. When we do the second leg, so my right knee has some rotation built into it, whether that's where the two bones connect or the lower leg, I'm not sure. It's just comfortable for me for my toes to point out. So I know there's a little bit of rotation. If I pull the two bones together, that's a hinge. Now I externally rotate. I'm going to pull the foot up. There's a little bit of rotation going into that knee now. It's also coming into my ankle joint a little bit to get the foot up. Is this healthy for my knee? Maybe, maybe not. How healthy is it? Probably not super healthy. Might be a little problematic. There is some rotation happening. But really where it's going to be problematic is this second side. If I pull those two bones together and line them up and turn out from my hip joint, now how am I going to get this foot up here? That's going to rotate in the knee for sure. The second side coming up is always going to be more problematic. Now again, if you have rotation naturally built into your body, then maybe this pose is okay, but most of us don't. Another place where we see this is if you're doing any of those poses where you're trying to get your foot behind your head, you have to rotate into the knee joint to get that to happen. Also, some of the poses where we bring the leg up and over the shoulder or the arm. There might be some rotation happening in the knee joint there. The whole point of the story is you want to try to bring the two bones together as a hinge. And if you're rotating out, turning out, try to do it from the hip joint while keeping those two bones together. And sometimes going deeper and further into a pose really isn't helpful. Our society is really focused on more is better. And yoga teaches us a lot about the middle path. Yes, move your body. Yes, stretch out the hip joint. That's all really helpful. But we can also go too far. And if we're exploiting that rotation in the knee to try to go into this really deep pose to get this picture or this perceived notion of what the pose is supposed to be, then we can start to cause ourselves some harm. It's really about listening to your body, trusting your body, your intuition, and trying to find that middle path. Give it a shot in your body and let me know how it goes. I would love to hear your feedback.